I'm here with Julian Franks, Professor of Finance at London Business School. And Julian, we're going to talk about your recent paper, The Benefits of Access, Evidence from Private Meetings with Portfolio Firms, which you co-authored with Marco Becht and Hannes Wagner. And in that, you gain insight from a huge database of investor meetings held by an investor with their portfolio companies. But just describe for us the study.
Well, first of all, as you say, it's about a single asset manager, Standard Life, now Aberdeen, and they have given us their data for 9 years, their engagement data. By engagements, I mean the engagements with portfolio firms that funds have stakes in. And these engagements are undertaken by three groups of people: by the governance and stewardship team, by fund managers, and sector analysts. And I'll expand on that a little later. And the fundamental question we're asking is, do these engagements generate information? And if they do, how does Standard Life take advantage of this information? And to what extent does it contribute excess returns or alpha to the individual funds?
Okay, so you've described some of the different parties in play, in particular the portfolio managers and the governance people and the analysts. But who is it that's actually having the meetings with the portfolio companies? How are they run, and what sort of information are you seeing in those meeting records?
Well, there are these three groups. The governance and stewardship team, they engage with portfolio companies, usually separately from the fund managers, but on occasions they will have joint meetings, but usually separately. And they don't engage with all the companies that Standard Life has stakes in. They engage with companies where they think there's a problem.
Right.
And the issues they engage in involve governance issues, let's say the composition of the board, the independence of the non-execs, compensation, environmental and social, that's the ES in ES and G. So very much it's governance and stewardship. So that's, if you like, one of the parties that engages. The second are fund managers. These are the guys who manage the individual funds within the Standard Life stable. And first of all, I want to say that there might be 5 or 6 asset managers or fund managers sitting in on a meeting with a portfolio firm.
Okay.
In fact, in one case, we know there are 15.
Right, okay.
And there is, conversations are very different. Their conversations really about the company's business model. They're about their performance. The word cost, the word margin, this kind of appears. So the conversations are very, very different. Now, the third group of people who engage is the sector analysts. And really the sector analysts are also fund managers.
Right.
So think of 5 fund managers going to a meeting with a portfolio firm. One of them is probably a sector analyst. And this is the guy who's going to integrate all the information from the governance and stewardship team, from the other fund managers, and integrate it into an internal recommendation on particular stocks in the sector that they specialize in. So let's say it's the automotive sector. They will have buy, hold, and sell recommendations for the individual stocks in the automotive sector. And those recommendations go to all the fund managers within SLI, not outside SLI, within SLI. And what we do is we look at to what extent do the fund managers trade on those recommendations, particularly where the recommendations change from a buy to a sell to a buy, or hold to a buy, and to what extent do those trades generate excess returns and contribute to alpha.
So let's just break that down then into 2 parts. And so in the paper you describe the relationship between output from the meetings, changes in these recommendations, and trading. So just talk us through that bit of the trade, the chain, and we'll come back to alpha.
So if you look at the sector analysts, imagine the sector analyst changes from a buy to a sell. what we're really interested in, to what extent is he using meetings, with the information that's generated, to influence that decision? So what we do is we categorize trading decisions into, if you like, or rather we connect trading decisions with these internal recommendations, and we divide them into two, where there was a meeting close to the change in recommendation and where there was no meeting. And what we find, as I'll discuss in a few more minutes in more detail, we find that where the recommendation change was associated with a recent meeting, let's say in the last week, 10 days, that generates far more trading by fund managers than when there was no meeting.
And does it matter whether that meeting is a governance meeting or a portfolio manager meeting?
The answer is it matters in one sense, and it doesn't matter in another. Whether it's a governance and stewardship meeting or a fund manager meeting, it generates trading.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Which generates excess returns, which I'll
Yeah.
talk about. How much to attribute to each is more difficult because fundamentally we don't know how the sector analyst is weighting the governance and stewardship versus the meeting by the fund manager. We know that the sector analyst will talk about the governance meeting or not. We know the sector analyst will talk about the fund manager meetings. We know that. But how much of the trading is attributable to each is difficult. But we can say that there's more trading for both sets of meetings.
So, I mean, this is sort of interesting because I'd like to ask you what's going on in these meetings, because on the face of it, there shouldn't be price-sensitive information shared in these meetings, and so you could argue that the meetings shouldn't be useful unless they're illegal. But I mean, they clearly are useful because the information is influencing trading. So, what's your interpretation of what's going on here?
Yeah, this is a question that always comes up in every single conversation, every single seminar. As you might expect, there's people within Standard Life who are responsible for regulating and making sure that trading doesn't happen when there's inappropriate information that has been transmitted. We have looked at a little bit of that, but we don't know a great deal about that. What we do know is the content of meetings. And if I could give you an example, or a couple of examples, where Carillion, which, as we know, went bankrupt, went into administration, Standard Life originally had a stake of 10%. The governance and stewardship team met with the chair of Carillion, and we can see the meeting notes which describe that meeting, which was clearly an uncomfortable meeting. If I was to summarize it in a sentence, they found that the chairman was a light touch chairman, a very busy chap.
Yeah.
And the consequence was that within 10 days, the sector analyst had moved from a hold to a sell.
Yeah.
And actually, Standard Life sold their entire stake before the company went into administration. So it's clear from a very detailed record of that meeting that there was a feeling that the chairman had not got a grip on the company. In a second case of a tobacco company, the meeting note showed very explicitly that they were going to vote against certain directors and that they were very worried about the governance of the company. And they did vote against them, and they did, within 10 days, they sold between a quarter and a third of their holding. So we're looking for the proximity of the meeting to the change in the internal recommendation, but more than that, we're looking at words that describe the quality of the meeting and whether it's governance and stewardship or fund manager, words like a good meeting, a very good meeting, a bad meeting, a very bad meeting. And we're looking at those words and correlating them with not just the recommendation change, but with the intensity of trading and the excess returns.
So what you've described there is information coming out of these meetings that is somewhat nebulous. I mean, it's clearly not specifically price-sensitive information. So is this just sort of confirmatory to other stuff that's going on? Or
Well, the best way of describing it is to use this phrase, mosaic theory. And mosaic theory is not connected with the Old Testament, but rather it's connected with the mosaic, the floor mosaic.
Yeah.
And I think what these meeting notes tell us is that they are the final tiles in the floor, in the mosaic. So there is some unease, or there's, because remember, these meetings can generate buys as well as sells. These are kind of the last tiles that push the internal analysts to say buy or sell. Now, I should say that for the governance and stewardship team, on average, the internal analysts, it's a sell, and there's net selling following a governance and stewardship. For fund managers, actually, it's a bit different.
So that's consistent with governance being viewed as a bit of a risk factor, and they're trying to avoid downside risks coming out of meetings.
I'm only going to call you if I'm in governance and stewardship. I have a problem. It's not to wish you
not
happy
to congratulate
Christmas.
you on your great
No.
governance.
No.
And so what we've got so far then is so we've got meetings that matter in the sense that they affect the internal analyst recommendations, and they doubly matter because recommendation changes associated with meetings have higher intensity trading than other recommendation changes. So now the real kind of crunch question is, does it add alpha?
Yeah. Well, I think we're unambiguous here. We believe it does add alpha.
Right.
And we think the kind of excess returns from this trading that you observe following meetings, the excess returns is something like 80 basis points.
Wow.
Where there's a recommendation change without alpha, recommendation change without a meeting, then we're talking about maybe 30 basis points. So there's a very big difference between trades that follow meetings and trades that don't follow meetings. And one qualification, these are kind of gross abnormal returns. These are the gross returns to trading. We haven't deducted transaction costs. I will say that Standard Life uses an internal trading desk, I think for very good reasons. They don't want this information to seep into the market, or they want it to seep into the market as slowly as possible. So they manage that trading during the day or during the days that follow the recommendation change.
So, I mean, presumably much to the relief of Standard Life Investments, I mean, this study seems to show pretty clearly that this stewardship activity matters and it adds alpha. But this is just a study on one asset manager. And what conclusions do you think we can draw for stewardship more generally, and indeed, what are the policy implications of this, do you think?
Well, first of all, meetings with portfolio managers matter. How much we can attribute this, the excess returns, to the governance and stewardship versus the fund manager, that is difficult to apportion it. But both clearly matter. Standard Life has a reputation for having a very good governance and stewardship team. And that's good and bad news for our study, because while Standard Life may be pleased with the results, you might think of, well, there are a lot of other asset managers who don't put the resources into engagements, whether it's by governance and stewardship or fund managers. There's a lot of closet indexes. So in that sense, it's difficult to generalize. I do want to kind of say one more thing. It's an interesting question why Standard Life, if you like, gave us all this data. And it followed on from a study that I did with Marco Becht and Colin Mayer with a hedge fund activist, where we looked at how they engaged, we looked at the returns they made and their contribution to alpha. And the issue with Standard Life is that their engagements were over such a long period that we weren't sure how we were going to estimate, if you like, the gains from engagement. We had no sense of, meetings, internal sector analyst recommendations, trading in excess returns. We didn't yet contrive that methodology. So I think that Standard Life, I'm not sure they had any priors. My priors were that over such long relationships, we would probably not find very much. So it's one of those occasions when I was surprised by the findings, and I think much is to do with, if you like, this methodology of relating meetings to internal sector analyst recommendations and the trading that follows.
Well, I think certainly as well for stewardship code providers, regulators, asset owners, I think this does provide some confirmatory evidence that at least for a strong practitioner like Standard Life Investments, there are benefits to be had from good stewardship. So I think that's...
I think that's entirely right. Instead of traditionally looking at governance and stewardship as a cost centre, you should think of it as a profit centre.
Terrific. That's been a fascinating discussion. Julian, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.